my name is Emma Goodyer and I'm Programme Lead for the IUCN UK Peatland Programme. I'd like to give a very warm welcome to Day 2 of the 10th Annual IUCN UK Peatland Programme Conference. So today's theme is around the science and informing strategy and action, and also the coordination of peatland science and monitoring. So in yesterday's discussions, we really briefly touched on some science and monitoring aspects. And if peatlands are truly to become an integrated theme across climate, biodiversity and land use policy, then we as a community really need to start and bring illustrations of the benefits of carbon, water, biodiversity and the economic benefits as well. So are we quantifying these benefits effectively to enable us to demonstrate peatlands' key role across these strands? And I guess that's a question to reflect upon throughout today. And I hope that today also we'll be able to identify some areas where we can do more to highlight peatland benefits and also to work towards improving our national monitoring and reporting frameworks. So I've got a few just little items of housekeeping to raise before we start this morning. So for those of you who weren't able to join us yesterday, please do take a little time to familiarise yourself with the conference platform. And you'll see on the left-hand side of your screen, there's a menu it's on the homepage of the conference platform, which links to various spaces within the event. So do drop us a message on the notice board or an interesting PT photo. Have a look at the hashtag PeatConf20 Twitter story wall, or also make use of the drop-in lounge and chat to other attendees during the break sessions as well. So sessions from yesterday are also available to watch again through the relevant link in the agenda. So if you missed any, you can catch up on some of the highlights through following back onto the day 1 session of the agenda. And any unanswered questions as well will also get posted by our team onto the notice board today. And they'll also be collated by us to inform future discussions and sessions for future IUCN events as well. So all of the feedback you gave yesterday will be taken forwards into shaping the work of the programme. So it's really, really valuable that you keep posting those messages. So we also noticed yesterday that a few of you reported having issues joining breakout rooms. And just to highlight, this is really best done using Google Chrome where possible as a browser, because Internet Explorer isn't supported by the conference package. And Sarah Proctor also just wanted me to mention, Sarah's our Head of Development and Communications within the team. There's still some exhibition spaces left within the exhibition hall. So if you could send an email to info@iucn.org.uk or just chat directly to Sarah Proctor online by close of play today if you'd like to make use of that exhibition space. And don't forget, during the talks this morning, do make use of the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen while people are presenting. And you can add any comments or thoughts there, but then also use the specific Q&A tab to submit questions specifically to our presenters this morning for the Q&A session. So your question will get reviewed by a moderator, and then as questions are voted on by members of the audience, the most popular ones will automatically rise to the top and are more likely to be answered. So have a look at the questions that are coming through. We're really fortunate this morning to have 2 eminent speakers joining us for the first session. And first up, we have Andrew Millar, the Chief Scientific Advisor for Scottish Government. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Emma. And thanks to the organisers for a really smoothly running conference. I've had no troubles with it so far. So I'm the Chief Scientific Advisor for Environment, Natural Resources and Agriculture, and my role is to provide independent science advice to Scottish Government on issues all over the environment, the wider rural economy, and particularly to champion the use of evidence to inform policy development and delivery. So within that remit, it turns out that includes wastewater and screening for the COVID virus in wastewater. So I'm afraid I'm going to be somewhat taken elsewhere for part of the time of this conference. But one of the things that I've been really pleased to work on within that remit is peatland science and the underpinnings for a really dramatic shift in peatland policy in Scotland. Here I'm taking material from the slides of Andrew Cooper and Ben Dipper that they showed yesterday. This just shows the progress in the past 8 years of the Peatland Action Programme, from hundreds of hectares restored starting 2012-13 through to 6,000 odd hectares a year last year, and a commitment over the next 10 years to restore roughly as much peatland area every year as we have so far in the entire programme, and to spend roughly as much money as the entire programme has spent up to now every year for 10 years. So that illustrates a point that Ben made, that peatland science is enjoying a sharply increased profile with Scottish ministers. Now that's thanks to the efforts of many people who will be on the conference today. And that's a really important step towards the action to restore peatlands, both for biodiversity and for climate change. And as the IUCN strategy communication part points out, now we just need everyone else. So the part of everyone else that I'm particularly concerned with is the science and the research ecosystem. So these are the people who produce the evidence base to advise on that programme of restoration. In particular, I advise Scottish Government's RESAS research programme, which invests about £48 million a year in areas all across my remit. It includes funding for peatland science at the James Hutton Institute, for example, and I'd particularly like to highlight our 4 virtual centres of expertise. The 2 relevant ones here are CREW, the Centre of Expertise for Waters, and Climate Exchange, the Centre of Expertise for Climate. As we're here hosted by IUCN, I should just highlight our next 5-year strategy includes starting a centre for biodiversity. The point about centres of expertise is that not to create new academic understanding, rather these are boundary organisations which mediate between policymakers and the research base. So they help policymakers to formulate research questions and commission the research, and they help researchers to provide outputs of their research in the forms that are best usable by policy teams. So a really critical role, particularly in an area like peatland, where there are very significant science challenges. You can see a couple of examples of those challenges on this rather busy slide, where here in the top left, I'm showing the CCC's version of Scottish emissions pathway, historically in blue, and in the future in green. Now, the reason those 2 lines don't connect, as many people on the call will be familiar, that difference just in here, that is the inclusion of peatland emissions within the greenhouse gas inventory. So the huge area of peatland across Scotland, and the fact that maybe 75% of it is in poor condition, those together create this really significant change in our greenhouse gas inventory. And of course, to inform that estimate, we need much better monitoring and evaluation, not only of the area of peatland, but also of their quality, their condition. And so that's an area of ongoing evidence need. And the importance of that is highlighted here bottom left in this graph, which comes from CEH with inputs from Rebecca Arts of Hutton and others. So this is taking the emissions factors from different types of peatland and multiplying them by the area occupied in Scotland by that peatland type. So what the graph highlights is that this area of intensively managed grassland, just 4% of Scotland's total peatland area, produces 34% of the emissions. That single statistic should make it really clear that it doesn't make sense for the medium term to continue with peatland targets based on area. The areas of peatland vary hugely, and we need to move towards a system which recognizes the distinct contributions of each part of our peatland area, not imagining that all areas are the same. So this really brings us to the evidence, the new science, that is going to reduce the areas of uncertainty so that we can achieve those ambitions, like moving away from, moving beyond area targets. The Peatland programme very appropriately highlighted an aspiration to move from strategy to action in this conference. COP25 was also a focus on action. And what in the next part of the talk, I'd like to highlight 3 different dynamics, 3 different changes that I think frame a real opportunity for Peatland, the Peatland community, and for the science community to work more effectively together to get that evidence into the Peatland science process. Sorry, the Peatland action process. So first up, let's think about where the evidence affects the Peatland system, all of this community who are here on the call today. Traditionally, we can think about evidence as an input to the process. There was a distinction between fundamental and applied research, and from applied research, we got a framing of the big challenges we face as a society, including climate change, including the nature crisis. We got tools for thinking about them, like the systems analysis, systems thinking. And that led us to an interaction with policy where you have ideas like evidence-based policymaking, a very powerful, very, very beneficial idea. But the type of evidence that's provided to that process is also really important. And so from that, from the difficulty of using pure science evidence comes an idea of co-production, that the best evidence is obtained when policy teams can inform the way that the research is done. And this is going to be a familiar concept in this community. So my first argument is that we are now moving beyond that process. We're moving into an area which has previously been characterized as action research. And I prefer a phrase, learning by doing. Think back to the slide of the hectares restored by Peatland Action in Scotland. That's a massive intervention in the landscape. This is a huge opportunity to gather new evidence. And across the whole of climate change, across many parts of the nature crisis, the actions that we are taking are going to be on such a large scale that increasingly we will be gathering action-based evidence. So this is an opportunity which we need to seize, the whole community needs to seize. We should not be starting policy actions unless we are also collecting evidence, evidence to evaluate those actions, evidence to understand the system better. And the key change is that evidence is now an output from the system rather than an input to it, or at least the balance between output and input has changed. And there's an opportunity here for everybody else as well. It means that everybody engaged in the process is producing evidence and can contribute to produce evidence. So everyone's a scientist. Now, some of you may not be keen on seeing yourselves that way. And then there's another question about, is the rest of the research community also ready to adopt that change? So I think that is a challenge. And I see two reasons for optimism. So those are my second and third points. So the first reason for optimism is that we can see, as well as this push from large-scale policy action, we can see a pull from changes inside the science community. Up here, this is just a screen grab from the Royal Society's website. I wasn't joking that everyone's a scientist. There is a working group within the Royal Society working on precisely that topic. And that's just one example of a wider change in the research community. The basic motivation behind the change is the realization that our idea of what is success has been too narrow. And I think Peatland research is possibly one of the areas that has suffered in that narrow concept of research success. Now, I know Professor Reid, who's going to be speaking after me, has been working with Maggie Gill and others on a really interesting study of how peatland science has been operating. And this is a perspective perhaps to look at that work. So this, for the aficionados amongst you, the REF impact process is indeed part of that same idea of changing research culture. But REF, it's more than research impact, and it's more than REF. And the portrait that I'm showing here, bottom right, is one of the real reasons for optimism. So Ottoline Leiser has accepted a role as Chief Executive of UKRI earlier this year. Now, Ottoline is one of the smartest people I know and is also very strongly engaged in changing the culture of research. And she's now in a position where she will have even more influence over that culture. And I know that she sees the research system as potentially benefiting from a much broader concept of research success. So the third point is about who is actually doing the science and whether the organizations that we work in are ready for the change that I'm arguing is coming from this push of learning by doing and the pull of changing culture. So this is social science. Social scientists conceive this as the context of knowledge production. That's what we're engaged in. We're engaged in knowledge production. And here I should credit one of my colleagues, Peter Freeman, who was a project manager for many years in some projects that I did, but he's been what he calls a reflective practitioner, trying to understand what social science has to offer for we practitioners of research to understand how we can do it better. So social scientists conceive of this idea of knowledge production as coming from these four domains: government, academia, industry, and civil society. And it's the interaction between them that makes evidence-based policy-making work, that brings the learning by doing agenda. So this is just a way of thinking, this quadruple helix. And for many people, if I ask you, okay, where is a university on that diagram? You'd have no trouble in placing the university, right? Obviously, it goes into academia, but that's wrong. The university is not in academia. Even social scientists routinely confuse those two words. They use academia to mean university, but that's wrong. The university is a boundary organization. It sits somewhere in the middle of that group, and this is increasingly going to matter. So to explain what I mean by that, I'd like to tell you about a little research project that we did in Edinburgh called Nurturing Cross-Disciplinary Research. This is really tiny. It was meant to be very local. We just asked people that we saw among our colleagues who we thought were being very successful in this sort of area. They had big projects, £5 million or more, which were crossing disciplines, crossing boundaries. And I was looking for the sort of hot tips and tricks. How do these successful people do it? Can other people learn something from them? In fact, that turned out to be a really naive approach. The most interesting thing was not the tips and tricks, not what people did, it was the people. So in fact, we started analyzing things which social scientists would call institutional statements. They're things about how we see ourselves, how things really get done in these projects. And the answers are quite straightforward. Our people split into three groups. The most common group were people along this green axis of the triangle. They were either academics contributing to disciplinary science, the advancement of their discipline, and gaining credit and prestige from discovering things first, so academic priority. Or they were professional services staff who were completely in the background and they supported the academics. So that was about more than 2/3 of the participants. And rarely, about less than a third, we found people who were engaged in a completely different type of work, which we call innovation. So these are people who are engaged not in advancing a discipline, but in creating a change in the world using outputs from research within the university. So their motivation and their aims are completely different to the motivations of the academics. And the way they work is also different. So we could characterize the academics as performers, the stars of the university. And they operate in research groups. And I used to have one. It was called the Millar Group. And the fact that it had my name is entirely consistent with what you might call this mode 1 knowledge production. That's a long-standing term in social science literature. But over here in the innovation space, the leaders are not the performers. They're more like impresarios who bring people together in teams. And the team has a name, which you may know, even though you don't know the name of the leader. So I now lead a group called the BioRDM team for research data management. These people thrive by creating long-standing projects, and it's the project name or the center name, which is the star, not the individual. And this is characteristic of mode, what social scientists call mode 2. So the conclusions from that is yes, universities include a strong academic domain, but they also have innovators as well as academics. And these intermediate scale projects are really important to allow the connections with other domains. So when we think about this quadruple helix system, we should be seeing that the university has the potential to nurture lots of these little organizations, oh great, there's the fire alarm. This really is live. Centers or research projects. So putting together the three things I've said, we have a pull from a changing research culture, we have a push from learning by doing, and we have this possible change in the way that universities conceive themselves. Together, I'm arguing that these changes will help everyone to work with university people. And in Scotland and the UK, when that works well, the power of that system is really impressive. And it can be applied in Peatland, even to a greater extent than it already is. And we can see the effect of that in the international dimension, for example, when it's no surprise that in COP25, even with a very short run-up, I was able to organize an event with the Chilean government, which focused on Scotland's contribution in peatland science. And I was very pleased that some of my colleagues who may be on the call today could join us in Madrid for an event when we had a very high level access and an ability to tell the story of Scotland's peatland restoration, along with peatland specialists from many other countries. And this is an opportunity which we can seize together, researchers and the rest of the community, and make a big difference. We have a real opportunity to do so over the coming decade. And obviously, if we don't, then we know that there are negative consequences, which we need to do everything we can to avoid. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Andrew, for that talk. That's wonderful. It's great to hear of the amount of comprehensive programme of work that's going on in Scotland. And I think in particular for me, right at the start of your talk, it was that highlighting the need to move beyond the area-based payments and targets, I suppose, is a really valuable message, I think, to keep at the forefront of our minds today. So following Andrew is Mark Reed, who is research lead for the IUCN UK Peatland programme and has recently moved to a new post in Edinburgh as the Professional of Rural Entrepreneurship and Director of Thriving Natural Capital Challenge Centre within Scotland's Rural College. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to be following from Andrew, and couldn't agree more with everything that you've just said, Andrew. And I think that things are really changing, and there is a recognition now that we need these hybrid spaces that sit between universities, governments, practitioners, people in the third sector, like many of us here today. In technical terms, they're often called boundary organizations because they span these different boundaries and bring people together. I recently published a paper, in fact, analysing climate exchange. This came in part from a review of the Scottish Government Strategic Research Programme that showed climate exchange as a key beacon of light in terms of the impact that research can have when you organise it in the right way. I'll put a link to that paper later on. But a great example of what is in theory possible. And so that's very much the kind of approach I'll be taking as I start this new role. I just started this month, and co-produce with, I hope, many of you over the next year, SRUC's Thriving Natural Capital Challenge Centre, which will of course include a major peatland component. So in this talk, I'm going to update you on some of the work that I've been doing with IUCN UK Peatland Programme and the Global Peatlands Initiative from the United Nations that Diana spoke yesterday, and others, to try and enable research and researchers to better inform policy and practice and overcome some fundamental challenges to the kind of evidence-based policy that Andrew was just talking about. If you were on the presentation, the presentation yesterday on the country presentations, you'll know just how challenging it is to create national peatland policy. Essentially, and the thing that came out to me across all of those presentations, it is a job of balancing trade-offs. So yeah, we want to reach net zero. We're doing all the stuff for the climate, but perhaps at the expense of the benefits already enjoyed from by local communities or by diversity. Where can we get those win-wins? And sadly, very often interventions that work in one location or for one purpose may have very different consequences for other locations, other communities, other purposes, if we apply them in a one-size-fits-all approach. Now, the last time I met Andrew face-to-face, I think, was at COP25, and I think Andrew himself is a great case study of a researcher being part of the solution rather than just complaining. And there are lots of us, and you know yourself, if you're there, complaining on Twitter about the latest government decision. Well, yeah, you know what? This is not easy, and we can, if we want, all be part of the solution. I think one of the biggest things that we are guilty of as researchers is making policy recommendations from single studies. And I know that I've been guilty of this myself. And it's often come from my funders. My funders tell me that they want me to write a policy brief at the end of my project. And it has to be with their logo, all about my project. And so I do my best to come up with something policy relevant, but it is on the basis of one single study, often one case study in one part of the country. And so what happens then when another researcher comes along with contradictory findings, which are just as robust, and they're now briefing in the opposite way to the very people I've just briefed? Well, of course, mass confusion and a bunch of questions. Well, maybe one of us got it wrong. Which one of us was it that got the answer wrong? Or perhaps it was just that we measured different things in perhaps a different ways, or maybe differences between our study sites or the length over which we took our measurements might account for the apparent contradiction. Clearly, this is no way to make good policy. And there are many civil servants I know and policymakers within our audience, and you know that your task is in fact to synthesize evidence from the patchwork of multiple studies and sites, rather than relying on single studies, no matter how persuasive that evidence from that one study might appear, because if you do that, then you end up with flip-flopping policy decisions. There is, of course, a problem. The majority of systematic reviews, and I've been involved in a number of these myself recently, are just not able to find enough high quality evidence that can be synthesized because everyone is measuring different stuff. Even if two groups measure exactly the same thing, say water table depth, they may measure it in very different ways, using different methods, which means that we still can't synthesize the data. Even if they measure the same thing in the same way, two different groups might present their data in ways that prevent synthesis. For example, omitting crucial contextual details like the location or the altitude at which the data was collected. So I don't know if I'm comparing like with like in my synthesis. Data that can't be used is, I'm going to suggest, the ultimate fieldwork fail. So if you want to laugh, have a look at the fieldwork fail hashtag on Twitter, and I will warn you, you will see an inappropriate image of me running through a Ugandan forest semi-naked. There's been some studies that have shown, I think it says in medicine, that 80% or more of research is wasted, i.e. it cannot be used because of these kinds of problems. And the upshot of all of this is that decisions in policy and practice are often informed by the results of individual studies, which are, as a result, then later contradicted by the findings of future research. And yeah, you've got a problem. So how could we do this better? Well, working with IUCN UK Peatland programme, many of you guys, in fact, many of you through our last annual conference and the Global Peatlands Initiative, we are trying to change how we actually collect and present and report data, whether that's research data, whether that's monitoring data from restoration programs. We can do this better. Our goal is ambitious. We want to change the way that peatland data is collected and reported, not just in the UK, but around the world, so that more and more people collect data on the same variables in ways that can be synthesized. Ultimately, the goal is to facilitate meta-analysis that can enable more evidence-based policy and practice. So the idea that we collect a whole load of different studies and we combine them together statistically to try and understand how this works, and some examples of what this looks like on the screen. So I'm coordinating a team with a number of colleagues, but in particular Dr. Gav Stewart and Dr. Dylan Young from Universities of Newcastle and Leeds, with support from the Global Peatlands Initiative. We trialled our process in UK peatlands. A number of you were at the original workshop in Newcastle and further contributed to this through the voting process at our last annual conference. We've now gone out and replicated what we did in the UK for tropical peatlands as well. And you can see the process that we're following on this slide. So, as you can see, part of this process is that, that we need to reach consensus as a community, and some of you have already taken part in that voting process. We met in Indonesia last year to try and identify some of the key indicators that could be measured in tropical peatlands, which is what we did in Newcastle for the UK process. We then supplement those based on the broader literature and other kind of follow-up processes. And eventually then we vote on this to come up with what the community agrees are the core outcome measures, the key variables that we should in theory all be trying to measure if we want to understand the health of our peatlands. So to give you a feel for what this looks like at the end of the day, here is one of the core outcome sets. It's a bit small. I'll give you something a little bit bigger to see in a moment. So I'll give you some outputs from the UK stuff. And yeah, so this is the climate core outcome set. So we've got for biodiversity and water hydrology as well. So if you look at the first 5 in the list, you can see that there is strong agreement across the group that we really do need to make sure that we measure rate of peat accumulation, peatland extent, and peat composition. So these are going to be in the core set of key indicators we'll recommend for measurement wherever possible in the UK. However, there is less agreement over the importance of measuring, say, peat build-up behind dams and dust losses. Okay, yeah, you might be interested, but this isn't a core thing we should all be measuring. Now, that doesn't mean that those things won't ever be measured. If they're important for your particular study, then you should prioritize them, but you'll do so in the knowledge that there may be few others measuring these, and as a result, there's less likelihood that your data is going to be used in future meta-analyses to inform wider policy and practice. Now, the next step is to move to methods, and we're identifying reliable methods that could be used to collect data for each of the priority variables. And that's going to range, of course, from the highly accurate but expensive and time-consuming methods that are more of the domain of researchers, through to methods that can be used by non-researchers and those with limited resources. And I think it's important if we want to engage communities in citizen science, or we want to enable practitioners and other organizations with limited resources to collect reliable data on key variables that have been prioritized. So we'll have that kind of menu as part of this approach. I'm going to put links in a moment to our 2 workshop reports. We're writing the paper that integrates the UK and the tropical data at the moment. We'll be submitting that for peer review publication in early 2021. Only a small element of that methods piece is going to be integrated. That's more work to come. Finally, I'd like to do a quick pitch for the Global Peatlands Initiative Research Working Group, which I'm chairing. We're going to be launching a new call for members in the new year, a link to a new website that we're developing for the initiative. And so I'm going to invite you in the chat to give me your email address, and that's in the understanding that you will then be added to the list There is going to be a formal process for this, so we will vet you. You need to be a Peatland researcher, but as Andrew defined, we are just considering this broadly. So there are many of you who have research expertise, things that you would be able to add to a group like this, and have a look in a moment to see what we're doing, to see if you think you can add, but you may or may not be in an academic position. First of all, we've got that's the membership call. A training program. So we're going to be launching a monthly training program in 2021 for the research community. In the second half of 2021, we're going to be broadening that out to the policy practitioner community as well. So if there are things you would like us to do in that, then please let me know, because that's a work in progress. Our first session is on the 17th of December. I'll give you a link to book into that, and that's if you want to write more competitive funding bids. And I'll talk in a moment about Maggie's report that Andrew alluded to on that we could all get better at that and get more funding for Peatland research that can help answer some of the questions our policy and practitioner friends have as well. We have produced a research agenda of key unanswered Peatland research questions and a list of potential funders globally, and a report of the 50 most recent Peatland research projects that have been funded, are under review, or are in development. And if you have something, especially if it's in development or under review and not publicly available, and are willing to share some information about that, it would be great. We'll be publishing that on the new GPI website early next year. I said I'd briefly just link to Maggie's report, and essentially the challenge that she has identified. In fact, I'll just put this last screen up while I talk to this to acknowledge my colleagues and my funders. So the problem that Maggie identified is that there are a whole load of really important research questions that seem to fall into a funding gap. So on the one hand, we've got stuff that government might fund, and on the other hand, we've got stuff that UKRI, the research councils, might fund. And UKRI say, well, this isn't cutting edge enough and global enough for us to fund this. That should be government. And government says, yeah, but that's like millions of pounds worth of stuff. And this is pure research, and it's going to produce a bunch of papers. That should be your job. And so a lot of this really important research stays unfunded. And essentially, if I summarize Maggie's conclusion, it was that we should coordinate funding across the community. So rather than complaining about this, as I suggested at the beginning, we can be that change and say, right, so there is bits of government funding, there are bits of research funding, there are other innovative forms of finance, non-traditional forms of finance that we could bring together. And if we could coordinate that as a community, rather than constantly competing against each other, might we actually be able to get the funding for the stuff that we need to do? So the GPI's research working group is a proof of concept to say, could we do that? As a global community, could we get researchers actually sharing what they're doing, bringing things together and getting this coordinated? And we have our first success, a funded project through GPI, co-led by me and Diana, starting in January. So I think we've proved concept here. My question to you is whether the IUCN UK Peatland programme should be trying to perform a similar coordinating role for the UK community. Just remains for me to say thank you to all of my colleagues and collaborators, and to the many of you who have contributed to this work. It would not have been possible without you, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. A real call to action there to get involved with some of the global things that are happening with GPI and your new research group at the moment. So thank you for that. And thank you both, Andrew and Mark, for two really complementary and very interesting presentations as well. We've got a few questions that have come in, and we've got a short amount of time, about 10 minutes, to have a look at some of them. And I think probably the most popular one that's come in is really looking about how we move towards some more coherent reporting. So how do we move to more focused and specific peatland reporting when the current status of the science lags behind, particularly for some aspects that aren't maybe carbon based? So especially when, as Mark highlighted, we're all measuring different things in different ways. So the question to both of you is sort of how do we start to close this gap and move towards more effective monitoring and reporting for peatlands?
So I think that's really mostly a question for Mark, because he directly addressed that in his talk. But I would just like to, on the policy side, I'd just like to go back to the comments for Scotland that Ben Dipper made, about these regional land use partnerships, which are a commitment in the programme for government. So one of the things that those must do is to integrate multiple data types in order to support decisions about land use, which include biodiversity outcomes, as well as greenhouse gas emission outcomes, social outcomes, and economic outcomes. So that's a structure that will help. But the question about collecting evidence is definitely one that Mark's consensus process should be addressing.
Yeah, good. So the first one is, of course, that consensus process, coming up with what are those key variables we should all be measuring. So as research lead for IUCN UK Peatland programme, we are regularly asked, so we've got a new peatland restoration programme, we've got the funding, we've got some money for monitoring, what should we monitor? And we just send them to various different researchers saying, here are some people doing some good stuff, ask them, but there is no answer to what should you be measuring. And so one instance recommendation here is that those of us who are funding peatland restoration can tie our funding to a commitment that you must measure at least a subset of these core outcomes that we've identified as the key things we need to know. So in medicine, you can't get funding for medical research unless you commit in certain areas. So in pain, if you want to do pain research, you have to commit to your funder. We will measure all of these core outcomes. Yes, we'll also measure some other stuff, but we'll do the core stuff. And that is a condition of funding. So that's instantly something that you can do. The coordinating of funding, well, at the moment we're primarily focusing on getting the researchers working together. That's a hard enough job, but there comes a point when you need to start bringing in the policy community as well. And because this is a working group which is chaired by me, but essentially led by the GPI with Diana Kapansky, that is enabling us at each of our meetings to integrate with the UN policy agenda. And we need to start getting that into this coordinated pitch for funding so that we know what the policy and other needs are as the research community. But more fundamentally than that, there is a need to change how the research councils work. So I'm part of BBSRC's one of their core strategy groups, influencing how they shape their funding. And as part of that, part of a group that are trying to shape a new programme, a multi-million-pound programme that will be coming on stream sometime next year on net zero. And one of the things I'm pushing for hard, and a number of other people are pushing for hard here, is that UKRI itself does things very differently. Because as stakeholders, you might be able to get involved at this point, and there were people from across government on this particular conference call to shape this call, but then you lose control of that, and you get a bunch of researchers proposing random things without talking to people in the policy community, evaluated by a bunch of peer reviewers, and then other scientists on panels who then weed out everything policy relevant and, or not necessarily, but prioritize what they believe is cutting edge science. And what you get at the end is a program of research that doesn't match what people actually wanted in the first place, and no way of those people even communicating with the projects that have been funded, and so it doesn't deliver. So there's a disconnect there, and as someone who researches impact and that whole funding landscape, that's something that I believe we can change, and I'm doing my best with what little influence I have to make a difference there.
I mean, that was something that definitely came up in one of the other questions as well, and in discussion in one of the breakout rooms I was in yesterday, about how, you know, obviously the conservation practitioners and the people that are doing restoration on the ground at the moment are incredibly constrained by all sorts of sort of funding timescales and pressures, and trying to add in monitoring to that mix as well as getting the practical work done on the ground is really challenging. And often it's the science and the monitoring that drops off the to-do list, if you like, because it's the pressure to deliver these sort of the hectare targets and the land area targets of restoration. So how do we start to deal with some of that in the funding packages we've got, I suppose? How do we start to make sure that monitoring and reporting is really a key part of these restoration targets, and that it doesn't sort of drop off the to-do list because of all these other pressures that are imposed?
Shall I take that one?
Feel free, Andrew.
So you know, I agree with that you know, statement of where we are, absolutely, but we should also be thinking about how we got here, right? So the UK research system changed profoundly after the great financial crash in 2007-8, when departmental research budgets, which had previously funded some of this activity, were slashed in the UK government, and there were consequences in the Scottish government as well. So UKRI, the challenges that Mark describes with UKRI funding partly arise because UKRI has had to pick up some of the science effort that would previously have been funded by other means. So, thank goodness they did that. But so it was somewhat an issue of the last budget standing. Now, hopefully, we should now be in a position with the UK's 2.4% GDP target for research and development to move the ecosystem back towards a broader base of funders. And as Mark is saying, that means that the UKRI funders should start to understand more about this process of funding policy relevant research, but also that other funders should be able to participate. And I would absolutely echo Mark's point about the central role of UNEP GPI in this, and the personal success of Anna Kapansky in nurturing the community that we're all working in. So she was very important in the international work that I spoke about, and I should have recognized her at that point. I think that the point to come back to is where we go from here. So it is not the case that fundamental science will stop, or that disciplinary research will stop, or that the criteria for peer-reviewed publication will fundamentally change. Those are going to continue. What we need to do is to have a broader system that allows other outlets for real research, including action research, other than the peer-reviewed journals. And that I see as happening, but I think I've probably said enough. Mark may want to pick up.
Excellent. Oh, thank you very much for responding to that. I think we've probably reached the end of our time for sessions, so I'd like to just say thank you very much to both of you for your contributions this morning. And I hope you'll be able to stick around for the rest of the conference and able to listen to some other sessions. So our next session... Yeah,
I'm going to pop into the chat room, so anybody who wants further questions, maybe we'll meet there.
That would be great, Andrew. Thank you very much for your time. That sounds good. So our next session is on peatland conservation goals and monitoring in the UK, and that begins at 10:50. So you've got a little bit of time to stretch your legs and go and put the kettle on, and we'll see you again shortly. Thank you.